Thank you all for coming out on this rainy day so close to your holidays. Thank you so much to the Independent and Public-Spirited Media Foundation for inviting me, and also to Rohini Nilekani, who's been really a mentor and an advisor now for many years. I'm very moved to be here. I started studying Indian media when I was an undergrad in the United States and got interested in some of Amartya Sen's theories about the media after his 1982 Coromandel speech. My first trip to India was in 1984, and I've been able to come back to India many, many times and travel really the breadth of the country. Then I met my husband, Joseph Stiglitz, who I met when I interviewed him for an article, and he's been coming to India since about the 1967, I think, was his first trip. So I never thought that I'd be up here giving a lecture, and I'm really honored and grateful. I think that the work that the Independent Public-Spirited Media Foundation is really essential in this time, and I'm going to talk about some of my own research on the history of investigative journalism in the Global South, and some of my recent work on who are the contemporary global muckrakers and what are they doing. Many of them are your grantees and are in the room, so I salute you. For all the important work you've done. I've learned from my students that it's really important to always finish on a cheerful note or people get too depressed. So I'll finish up by talking about some of the things I've learned and some of the solutions that I'm seeing around the world. So I come to you from Trump's America, and as you know, it's been a very, very hard time for journalists in my country. Journalists have been attacked almost daily on Twitter by our president. And the Committee to Protect Journalists has now had to actually set up an American office and do missions to the United States to look at the conditions there. We're not the only people who are struggling. As you can see from this slide, and you can see by what's missing on this slide, we're thinking about Hungary and Poland and the Philippines under Duterte, Turkey under Erdogan. There's been really a global attack on the media. My husband told me to print out my slides, and I ignored him, so I'm going to use my phone so that I'm not constantly turning back. So this is just some of the headlines that we've had to encounter over the last couple of years. Part of my argument is that since 2016, the importance of journalism has risen globally. In many cases, it's really the journalists who've been taking on the corruption and the demagogues who've come into power in all sorts of countries. Brazil would perhaps be the most recent example. While judiciaries and journalists have been really on the forefront of fighting for truth and for holding governments to account, other institutions and other politicians have very often collaborated with these demagogues. So I really salute the journalists that are still rising up and are still fighting. Academia, of course, where I have my home as well, and some of the legislators have tried to resist these terrible global trends. And for their part, what these demagogues have tried to do is either attack journalists straight on or capture them through economic means, through the use of advertising and through ownership. So the need for the small outlets and the small independent outlets has remained as strong as ever, if not stronger. So I'm really glad to be in a room of people who understand that. I've got here some examples of the different attacks on the press around the world. It's been really ugly. We've seen thousands of journalists, put in jail in Turkey. In the U.S., we've had shootings of journalists, and in one case, you'll remember someone running for Congress actually beat up a journalist and then won his seat the next week. The public media has been renamed national media in Poland, and of course in Hungary, capture has been very complete, as well as Russia and in other places. So all around the world, we're seeing kind of a resurgence of media capture, as well as violent attacks on the press. All of this has happened at this, let me see if this is, all of this has happened at the same time that the business models have collapsed. And so journalists who are needed more than ever and have to struggle more than ever to get the work done are facing a huge, huge loss of income. And this is due to a whole lot of things. The migration of advertising online to Google and Facebook as well. plateauing circulation in many cases, the costs of print, the aging out of many of the audiences, and the difficulty of competing with platforms whose business model is based on generating outrage and improving their engagement. So it's been a really hard time for journalists, and journalists who are continuing to produce quality journalism find that they're often drowned out by the toxicity of disinformation and misinformation that goes viral online. So some of the outlets that you referred to, some of the outlets are managing to sort of claw their way back. The Guardian has seen a huge increase in membership and in donations. The New York Times benefited from a Trump bump, which also seems to have plateaued recently. But it's a difficult time for journalists who are trying to fight a lot of fires all at once, keeping up their reporting and their independence while struggling to keep the lights on. I think that 2016 was really a wake-up call all over the world. The election of Trump and the support of Brexit really made everybody start to wonder what exactly was going online and what could journalists do to combat all of the disinformation and misinformation. And I think what's happened is that journalists have really doubled down on the idea of truth-telling and holding power to account. And although the space is shrinking, they're still able to have impact in many places. But what we've seen overall in many parts of the world is a huge decline of local news, the creation of what we call news deserts in the United States. And this has had a really hard impact on democracy. I think you referred earlier in the introductory remarks to the important role of journalists in promoting democracy and serving as a fourth estate. And there's now plenty of research in the economic literature and in the political science literature delineating some of the key roles that journalists play. Electoral accountability is related to journalism. Politicians who are revealed to be corrupt often don't get voted back in again, and that's partly thanks to the impact of investigative journalism. Voter participation is linked to the presence of strong media. There are studies showing that when media outlets close, voter participation declines. We know from the important work of Amartya Sen that when we have strong newspapers, government responds faster to natural disasters. You all remember in 1982 when Amartya Sen gave his speech and talked about how you couldn't have famines in democracies because the media would serve as an early warning system and then also to amplify pressure on the government to act. Besley and Burgess and other economists studied India to see whether that was true, and it turned out that it actually was true. Sen's theories do hold. And of course, the re-election of incumbents is related. When newspapers close, media outlets close, you see incumbents re-elected more often. So those are all some of the roles that media plays in keeping government to account and in helping promote a healthy democracy. I know this is really a downer, so I want to say that dark days do inspire groundbreaking investigative journalism. And this has been true really for more than 100 years. And part of my work has really looked at the role that journalists played in the 19th century, often with philanthropic funding and often working hand in hand with advocates, to call attention to all kinds of different global problems. The abolitionist movement against slavery funded their own newspapers. People who supported women's rights funded journalism. Trade unions supported newspapers as well. And the anti-colonial struggles benefited enormously from the role of the media. This was true in Africa, where many of the great anti-colonial fighters worked for newspapers, started newspapers, worked for each other's newspapers. This is true in Vietnam, and this is obviously true in India as well, where we know how important many of the pamphlets and newspapers that were published by the Congress Party, by the Communist Party, and by other independent fighters had an impact. Part of what we've been seeing in the last 10 to 15 years is some changes to the world of investigative reporting. As has been alluded to, it's being funded much more now by philanthropists, and that probably won't change. Digital technology has meant collaboration is much easier now, so we're seeing enormous cross-border projects around the world where journalists from all different countries are getting together. Instead of competing as they used to, they're now collaborating to produce big stories. As Paul Radu from the Organization for Crime and Corruption Reporting Project based in Bucharest always says, the criminals don't stop at borders, so why should journalists? So we've seen a lot of cross-border journalism now. There's far more data journalism, obviously, than there was. Massive leaks have contributed to some of the blockbuster stories, and presentation has gotten much more sophisticated. I think that the grantees of the Independent and Public Spirited Media Foundation are at the forefront of the use of digital, both for gathering, for disseminating, and for presenting their work. And so all of these points would be true of India as well. I'm trying to move this forward. Should I maybe just touch the computer? Thank you. Perhaps you could move the slide forward for me. Oh, great, yeah. So I think some of the big blockbuster stories that investigative journalists have been doing, often with foundation funding, include the Panama and the Paradise Papers story that really exposed money laundering and tax avoidance around the world. If you haven't seen the new Panama Papers movie, which is called, I think, The Laundromat, I highly recommend it, with Meryl Streep. Obviously, the Obadrek case and the Lava Jato in Brazil and Latin America, that's been an enormous cross-border story that's had a huge impact. 1MDB. The Malaysian story was broken by journalists who kept egging each other on and encouraging each other, and what we were talking about before about the amplification by the mainstream media. When the smaller investigative accountability digital outlets break these big stories, they force the rest of the media to catch up, and they can have impact that way. Gupta leaks, I'll be going to Johannesburg later in this next week, and of course the journalists there who did an enormous, fantastic job, Daily Maverick and Amabungani, breaking the story of the state capture in South Africa. And there's been some very detailed reporting on the corruption and ownership of companies in China. Let's see if this works. I think not. Do you want to? Oh, good. Great. So what I did with my book, Global Muckraking, was I decided to actually look back in history and get to know some of the investigative journalists from the Global South who had broken big stories and had done human rights reporting in the 19th century. And it turned out that this was kind of a forgotten subject, that when people thought of the muckrakers, they thought about the American muckrakers, and they weren't really thinking so much about the rest of the world. But it turns out there really has been global investigative reporting, and it's happened in many, many places that have been overlooked and ignored by history. So I edited this book called Global Muckraking, and it contained 37 pieces of investigative journalism from the Global South, and each piece was introduced by an expert or journalist or a scholar or historian who could put the piece of journalism in its context and explain why it mattered and the impact that it had. And Rohini Nilekani was kind enough to contribute to that book. I went on afterwards, sorry, do you want to move this forward? Oh yeah, to do a book called African Muckraking, which again brought together investigative journalism from all around Africa over the last 75 years, and again had different introductions explaining who the journalists were and what happened to them and the impact that their stories did or didn't have. Part of what I was trying to do was really de-Westernize journalism studies, because we remember the muckrakers, but they were really just about 15, 20 people in the US who worked for 20 years. And we remember people like Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle, and Ida Tarbell, who covered Standard Oil, and those reporters who covered inequality and urban conditions and corruption and the role of the big trusts, very much like today. But I wanted to look and see what had happened in the rest of the world. And so what I found was that, as I mentioned, there were NGOs working with journalists. This is not a new thing. People always say, oh, with the decline of the business model, the NGOs have taken over, they're creating all the news now, but actually they were working with journalists in the 19th century as well. And there were journalists in the 19th century who were doing advocacy and campaigning. That's not a new thing either. E.G. Morel, for example, who was writing about the Congo, Henry David Nevison, who was campaigning against the conditions in the cocoa plantations that were owned by Cadbury, who had a reputation for being a wonderful employer. And I feel that to recognize these links between advocacy and journalism and philanthropy and journalism is really to honor the journalists who did this work, and again to sort of contribute to the de-Westernizing of our ideas about journalism. It wasn't always the sort of Watergate, Woodward Bernstein, just the facts ma'am, in the raincoat, breaking the news. There were those relationships between activists and journalists, and they've existed for a very long time. In a way, my work is sort of a peek into the era of campaigning journalism that came before what Michael Schudson would describe as, the professionalization period that happened really in the US in the sort of 1930s onwards. So I wanted to kind of resurrect some of the 19th century. And I think, interestingly, in some ways, we've gone back to some of those traditions. I think that many of the bloggers now and the muckrakers now are similar to the activist journalists of the 19th century. They believed in facts, and they were very, very careful about gathering evidence, and they had scientific precision, but they had opinions, and they had voices. And very often, they weren't necessarily journalists by profession. They were people who saw an outrage, and they dropped what they were doing, and they started a newsletter, or they started a pamphlet, and they just campaigned on a single issue. They didn't always last forever. Some of them gave up after 10 years, but very often, they actually had a big impact. I got really interested in the question of media impact. And again, there's been some literature on the question of impact and when journalists can have it and when they don't. A lot of the work has been around corruption, but I think that the research on corruption and the impact that journalism can have on corruption can actually be applied to a whole lot of other causes. So there's a lot of tangible ways that journalism can have impact, and that, of course, means when there's mechanisms of redress. So when you have a regulator that should be doing something, the journalism can really push them, and it can bolster the legitimacy of the government agencies to act. I think that the Panama Papers would be a perfect example, that when there was enough public outrage, it reminded the politicians and it reminded the EU officials that actually this was something they should be doing something about. Journalism can also preempt problems by acting as a scarecrow. Just by knowing that a journalist is there and asking questions and serving as the fourth estate can sort of help people behave better. Omoyele Sowore, the Nigerian journalist who's been in jail since August 3rd, started the Sahara Reporters website to cover corruption in oil, gas, and mining. And after he exposed one of the politicians who used oil revenue to buy themselves, I think it was a Bentley or a Rolls Royce, he heard stories that other politicians had canceled their orders. So those are intangible, and we can't calculate them, and they don't necessarily fit with all the, the metrics that are now in fashion, but it can, that can matter. Naming and shaming can also work in some countries. It doesn't work in the United States. The endless articles about Donald Trump and his shady dealings around the world with oligarchs and plutocrats and all the ways that he's broken the law or come close to breaking the law and certainly broken all the norms, like not hosting a G7 at your very own hotel or not encouraging foreign dignitaries to stay at your hotel and not giving jobs to your children. I could go on and on and on about the kinds of things Donald Trump has done. He seems shameless, sort of impervious to publicity, but there's plenty of places where naming and shaming is still effective and does make a difference. I was talking to some Australian fact checkers a few months ago who said that actually in Australia, pointing out when politicians have lied has actually helped. It's really made them stop in some cases. And then, of course, like NGOs, a key role for the media is to monitor compliance. So if a law has been passed or a problem has been addressed or exposed, going back and seeing what's happened. Has something actually happened? Has it stopped? So these are all key ways that journalism can have an impact, even in, and this is true, by the way, I was just corresponding with a colleague in Botswana this morning. This would be true very often, even in dictatorships and even in closed regimes. We find that the effect of the investigative journalism can still have an effect. It's harder, but it can make a difference. Yeah, oh, sorry. So going back to the 19th century, it was so much in many ways like today. So it was a time of incredible ferment, of huge trusts and corporations that were really out of control, of industrialization. And the way people got their information changed very dramatically. So the printing press and the railway and the telegraph and the newspaper all gave birth to a public that could share information and then act on that information. And in a way, many historians think that the 19th century was also the birth of the modern human rights movement. And so I like to put the global muckrakers in that context. They were a global movement. They talked to each other. Their stories had an impact globally, and India played a key role. If you will indulge me, I'll show you a few photographs that I took in the archives in Calcutta of some of the old newspapers. The Commercial Advertiser, the Calcutta Gazette, is one of them. And these papers are not, I don't know how many of you have spent time looking at 19th century, even 18th century newspapers. As you know, they're not digitized, and many of them are really falling apart. Amrita Bazar, Patrika, you can see what terrible condition it is in. Sometimes when I was reading the newspapers, I was almost scared to touch them. But the point about those Indian muckrakers is that their stories were read and imitated all over the world. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Dwarkanath Ganguly. He appears in our book, Global Muckraking. He was writing about human trafficking in the 1870s. He was looking at the conditions of the indentured servants who were trafficked from India and China to the Caribbean and Africa after the slave trade was officially abolished. And he made a long journey to the tea plantations of Assam in order to report on the conditions there. He published his expose in the Calcutta newspapers in 1886. And what's so interesting about the work of Ganguly is, although he's often forgotten, is that he spawned imitators. Journalists in Fiji and in Vietnam started writing about labor conditions and looking at their own sugar plantations because of the work that Ganguly had done. And of course, when the Congress Party got started for their campaign to liberate India from the British, human trafficking and labor conditions were part of their platform. And many of the problems that Ganguly exposed are still found today. Immigrants, migrants being tricked into signing contracts that weren't honored, signing on the dotted line to be underpaid, and then finding that they were really indentured servants, that those contracts kept renewing. After slavery was abolished, in a time of industrialization, large agricultural companies needed cheap labor, and so they did many of the tricks to entrap workers. That still happen. But Ganguly, even though he's forgotten, had an impact at the time. And so part of what I did in Global Muckraking was I looked at different countries and how they covered the exact same topics. So we had Jayata Sharma introduce Ganguly's pieces about India, but I put it next to a piece on trafficking from Australia. I put something on cocoa plantations in 1907 next to an article from 2003. And I wanted to show that journalists kept covering the same stories over and over again in different parts of the world. Often they'd have an impact, but often it was their responsibility to go back and find those problems again and expose them again. So we can be depressed because it feels like, oh, it's the same old thing, but I think we can remember that it's necessary and it has to keep being done. As I was editing this book, my father was dying of cancer, and I remember he said to me, "Doesn't your book depress you?" And I actually felt the opposite. I felt so inspired by the bravery and the perseverance and the commitment of these journalists to keep covering these unpleasant subjects when they could be doing something else, taking great personal risks as well. Sorry, I'm not doing very well with the, yes, good. So part of what made the impact from the journalist work was when there were other people who were involved in the same campaigns. So at the time that Ganguly was writing, there were groups that were very worried about labor conditions, and he was able to reinforce what they were doing. It would be the same with the tax avoidance question of the Panama Papers. We've had fantastic journalists covering tax avoidance and money laundering, but there's also been NGOs sort of toiling away in the background and trying to get political change. So I think that when we look historically at when the journalism made a difference, it's very often those stories resonate because of political circumstances and because of NGOs. So by themselves, the reporting might not do something, but when it's teamed up with civil society and eventually able to pressure government, things can really happen. And today, of course, as we've said, many of these global muckrakers are getting money from foundations. They're often still very small, but they still are having an impact. After having edited 2 books on global muckraking, I got interested in today's global muckrakers, and I wanted to know who they were and what they were doing. So I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to tell you about 2 reports that we did, where we examined closely who today's global muckrakers are, how they exist, and you know, what their world is like right now. So in 2015, we profiled 27 media organizations from around the global South, and we wrote a report called Publishing for Peanuts. And like the Independent and Public-Spirited Media Foundation, we looked for outlets that were publishing high-quality content, right? Because it's easy to sort of get attention if you're doing, you know, stuff that's meant to go viral. We wanted to look at organizations that are using digital technology to disseminate, to gather and disseminate information, again, very much like the Independent and Public-Spirited Media Foundation. And we interviewed them in 2015 and wrote profiles of them, and then we went back in 2018 to see how they were doing. And so many of the lessons we learned are really similar to the kinds of things that you showed in your slides. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of our findings. The outlets that we found in 2015 were really so much in a way like the outlets of the 19th century. They were usually founded by 1 or 2 people who were really passionate. They often just got money from family and friends and then a little bit of donor funding. They used a lot of volunteer staff as well and freelancers, and many of the journalists who started them had been sort of laid off by mainstream media and then decided to go start something else on their own. And their revenue came from a sort of a mix. So some of it was grants, some of it was individual donations, some of it was sort of haphazard business endeavors. We met people who started a cafe, people that were running events, people that were doing guides, you know, city guides, for example. Comic books, there's a group of Armenians in LA who are trying to make money off comic books. We found some refugees in a camp in Africa who started a cafe, software, consulting, training. And then when we went back in 2018, we found most of them were actually still going. Some of them had really changed their names and their business models, but they were around. And we did profile some in India, and both of these reports are online. They're available for free if you're interested. We were really interested to know what got people started. What was it that impelled these contemporary global muckrakers to begin? And we divided the triggers into 4 categories. So there were political ones, something tectonic like the Arab Spring shook everything up and suddenly created space for new accountability journalism. Sometimes there was regulation or regime change that mattered, and sometimes government imposed regulation, so journalists found a workaround. Sometimes things got a little bit freer, you know, like the transition in Malaysia, and so journalists sort of crept into the space, and that always happens. After World War II, you saw a huge influx of outlets. In France, after the end of Suharto in Indonesia, there were a lot more outlets. Same in Ghana after Jerry Rawlings. There's often a kind of flowering that takes place. Sometimes these outlets are very, very creative. So they constantly adjusted to whatever the changes in their finance were. So if there was a drop in audience, they found ways to get donor funding. If there was a drop in donor funding, they found ways to get money from their audience. They were constantly trying new things in order to survive. And very often, interestingly, the journalists told us that they got their ideas from going to a conference. So for all of you who are wondering whether conferences are a good idea, it turns out they really are. And also visits to peer publications. So many journalists, for example, have visited Malaysia Kini, and that's inspired them, or the Texas Tribune, or Investigate West. So there is a world, like with the Global Muckrakers, of people traveling around the world and learning from each other. When we went back in 2018, we found that although the content had often changed, the mission really hadn't. These global muckrakers, despite how difficult things have gotten, were still very much committed to the work that they were doing. And I'm sure we're going to hear from the panel about that later on. They were suffering financially, but they still believed that their work was important. And we asked all kinds of questions. Again, I won't tell you, explain the entire survey to you. You can find it online. But many of the founders were unable to get a salary from the organization. Some were. They often were supplementing with other activities when they had time. And, they found very often that that really what they just wanted to do was quality journalism, even though they were struggling. So many, over and over again, we were told by the journalists, I don't have an exit strategy. I'm not trying to get rich. I am just trying to hold power to account. So you can see pretty much nobody has an exit strategy of the muckrakers that we interviewed. Branko Brick from Daily Maverick said he hasn't even had a real offer to buy him out except by people who wanted to shut down his outlet. And that was true for lots of the people that we talked to. So they all said, we're just trying to keep going, essentially. And I salute them. Another lesson learned, which is discouraging, is that award-winning reporting does not equal financial security. So and this points obviously to the role for foundations. Many of the journalists that we interviewed had brought down governments, changed laws, brought in new policies had been enacted because of their work, but they weren't making money. And this is true of pretty much everybody, unless they were willing to start doing things like, selling business news, or a lot of consulting. Award-winning reporting, changing the world, being loved, stopped on the street, didn't mean that they were able to make money. So again, I really salute the donors that are still, willing to stick with it. Part of what I wanted to do was figure out some lessons learned, because I thought it would be helpful for all the other journalists who are trying to start their own outlets, who are running their outlets. And, I get regular invitations, like, please come and talk to our conference or come to our newsroom and tell us how to make money. So I tried really hard to figure out, were there any kind of 10 points that I could tell people. And, I feel like what we do know is that great reporting doesn't mean you'll find funding. And political transition is a double-edged sword. Sometimes a move to a dictatorship can help because those outlets become so necessary and needed. Sometimes moves to democracy can bring in more competition from other investigative journalism and make things hard. So I couldn't really come up with a hard and fast rule, so I left it with political transition is a double-edged sword. Clearly, there's a trend away from advertising revenue because we know where that's gone. It's basically gone to Google and Facebook. And events as well. A lot of the outlets that we interviewed have said that organizing those big gala dinners and those conferences and things like that turned out to be so time-consuming that they just weren't worth it. Another thing we found, and I guess this is anybody who's been to business school knows this, is that there's a tenuousness of first mover advantage. Being the first, muckraking outlet in a market doesn't mean you're going to survive when circumstances change. And we saw that again over and over again. And then my list of what sometimes work is clearly finding out what your audience wants And that's much easier to do nowadays because there's so many analytics available. But it's really essential. You know, we might say in business school, what's your value proposition? But just going out there determined to tell the world something doesn't necessarily mean you'll make money. Often, I think you referred earlier to the fact that in this world, having credible and trustworthy information is a niche that you can market, and that is, we found that to be the case in many, many places. When there's confusion about what's true and what's not and what's reliable, actually being honest and open about your work can be a business model. It can help. Another piece of advice I would give is not being too ambitious about expansion plans. I've seen many startups decide that they're going to expand dramatically, they're going to go into lots of countries, they're going to do global partnerships. That can really be tough if you're not making money in your home market. We looked at a lot of universities and big organizations that had incubated small outlets, and sometimes that seemed to really, really help. In some cases, we found tension between the universities or the publications that were incubating the small people, but it works sometimes, and I would recommend it, especially, I think, journalism schools, because they can provide sort of institutional knowledge and continuity over the years. The data suggests that setting up in a high-income area is always better. And some studies suggest that that's actually the most important variable. I think we'll probably talk more about things like crowdfunding and membership models, but they do work much better in high-income countries. So we've seen some real successes in Europe, and I'm thinking of things like Correctiv, Diario.es, The Guardian. Much, much harder to do. I would hazard that, you know, if you're in an area where per capita income is below $10,000 a year, it's going to be very, very difficult to survive from crowdfunding and membership models. Obviously, it's really important to have business-minded staff and a team that isn't just made up of journalists. Many of the startup founders that we talked to said they really regretted not having a business plan and business staff in place in the beginning. And then keeping your donors happy has now become a very important thing because so many people get donor money. I promised I would end with a couple of more optimistic thoughts. And one of the things I wanted to say is that because the world is so desperate right now, there's a lot of moonshots being thought about and tried all over the world. So I'm excited by that, and I think we have to think big if we want to save journalism. So James Dean from BBC Media Action and Mark Nelson are trying to persuade OECD donors to put together a fund of $400 million to support journalism in the Global South, and not just the small investigative muckrakers, but also the universities and even some of the public broadcasters. They've been trying to get support. They've got some support from the British and the Canadian governments. You know, I don't know if this is going to work, but it's something that they're looking at. And Luminate Foundation has funded some of the pilot studies. A group of European donors has gotten together and has started doing grant making around investigative reporting. In the US, Tim Carr and the Free Press is looking at things like attacks on micro-targeting done by Facebook and using that money to support media. In New Jersey, they actually managed to get a line item into the budget for support for investigative journalism. So I think now is the time when we all have to think really big and work on some of these initiatives. I'm helping some of these initiatives, and OCCRP and Drew Sullivan is also trying to get donors to put up a fund just for investigative reporting. So there's a lot of energy out there trying to think of ways to get donor money into journalism, and I think that's terrific. And I've been teaching in Paris this fall, and it's really nice to actually be in Europe where there's such a long tradition of government support for the media. And, you know, we often in the US overlook that, but there's all kinds of ways to support media and media plurality and diversity. So, for example, in France, there's a law that if you're a news kiosk, you have to carry all the newspapers. You can't just pick and choose, which is such a contrast to the US, where the newsstands were actually controlled by the mafia. Historically. France has also given out newspaper subscriptions to kids, to young people, to support young people reading the media. There are indirect subsidies, such as tax or tariff breaks that are being given, huge amount of news literacy that's being funded, direct subsidies to media outlets in many countries, and also indirect subsidies as well. And the goal in Scandinavia is to ensure that there's media plurality and media diversity. So they'll fund, the second largest newspaper in a town, so as to make sure that there's more than one outlet. So I think it's where we have, good public broadcasters, they can play a key role. Where we have good public broadcasters, that's often correlated with more trust in media. So I think that supporting quality media, whether it's the government doing it or the foundations doing it, is a really important thing to do. And I think it works, and it can be expensive, but it's more expensive not to. So basically, in conclusion, I just want to reiterate that journalism has a key role to play in holding power to account, in making sure that democracies are healthy. I think that the business crisis for media means that we need the philanthropists and we need government to help. I think that those small outlets are still playing a really key role, just as they were in the 19th century, and they have impact. But we've also got to keep supporting the big organizations that help as well. If you have a quality, it's fashionable to bash the BBC, but if you've got a big public service broadcaster that's doing quality, that needs to be supported. And then obviously, the importance of regulating the large tech companies is huge. So we've got to do something about Facebook and Twitter and the false information that's being circulated. And that's obviously a really thorny problem. I'm spending a lot of time right now looking at that. So if it comes up in the discussion, I'll be happy to talk about that as well. So thank you very much for inviting me and letting me share some of my research and some of my ideas with you. Part of the attraction for coming was this incredible panel that's about to follow, people whose work I've admired for years and followed for years, and of course the Independent Public Spirited Media Foundation, which is really a trailblazer for India. There's so much growth and excitement that's happened in India in the last, when you look at 20, 30, 40 years ago. And even just from an academic point of view, there's so much more academic research that's been done on Indian journalism and Indian media. When I first started reading about the subject in the 1980s, we had a few classic texts on the history of Indian journalism, and now, I'm meeting PhD students all the time that are writing about India. You mentioned media capture, and I just finished editing my third volume, and that looks at media capture around the world in the digital age. And Raju Narasetti, who many of you will know, contributed a chapter, and he had a lot more research to draw on than scholars had 20 or 30 years ago. So that's another good thing that we can really highlight, and thank you very much for your time.